He had everything: money, power, control, until one late-night call from his ex shattered his perfect world. "Michael, you have a daughter, and she's 5. Michael Harper had always believed that his life was perfectly calculated, like one of the spreadsheets his assistants prepared for him every morning. 39 years old, sharp-minded, and relentless in business, he was the type of man who never allowed surprises to enter his world. His office, perched high above Manhattan, reflected that control: glass walls revealing the glittering city below, polished mahogany desk without a single paper out of place, and the quiet hum of success that seemed to follow him everywhere. That night was supposed to be like any other: late hours spent reviewing contracts, a glass of whiskey untouched by his side, and the city lights reminding him of everything he had conquered. The phone on his desk rang. At first, he considered ignoring it. No one called him at that hour except for emergencies, and emergencies were something his staff was paid to prevent. Yet something in the silence of the room pushed him to answer. He pressed the button, his voice clipped, ready to cut the conversation short. But then he heard a voice he thought he would never hear again, a voice from another life, one that stirred memories he had buried under years of ambition. "Michael," she said, and the sound of her name unspoken yet instantly known filled his chest like a blow. "Rachel." For a long moment, he couldn't speak. His mind traveled back to 5 years earlier, her laughter in his apartment, the arguments that tore them apart, the way she had walked away without looking back. He had convinced himself she belonged to the past. But now she was here, in his ear, trembling and hesitant. He gripped the edge of the desk, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Why are you calling me?" The pause that followed was unbearable. He could hear her shallow breathing, as though she was gathering courage for something impossible. And then the words came, words that shattered every illusion of control he had ever had. "You have a daughter. She's 5 years old. Her name is Emily." Michael felt the room tilt. The glass towers of Manhattan outside blurred into streaks of light. For a man who thrived on precision, there was nothing precise in that moment. His thoughts scattered, calculations, memories, possibilities colliding in chaos. He tried to convince himself he had misheard, that this was some cruel mistake, but Rachel's voice carried no trace of doubt. It was calm in its fragility, and devastating in its truth. A daughter. His daughter. For 5 years he had lived without knowing, while somewhere out there, a child with half his blood had taken her first steps, spoken her first words, laughed and cried, and he had missed it all. The realization cut deeper than any betrayal he had endured in business, deeper than the failures he had always managed to turn into victories. This was not a deal to renegotiate or a scandal to bury. This was life, raw and undeniable. He sank into his chair, suddenly aware of how hollow his empire felt. For years he had measured his worth by the numbers on his company's reports, the respect of competitors, the fear in the eyes of rivals. But none of that prepared him for the sound of Rachel's voice telling him about a little girl with his last name unspoken but undeniably his. Michael wanted to ask 100 questions at once. Why hadn't she told him before? What did the girl look like? Did she know about him? Did she hate him already, for never being there? But the words refused to form. He was trapped between anger and disbelief, between the man who built walls around his heart and the man who suddenly felt those walls crumble with a single truth. When Rachel finally whispered, "She has your eyes," something inside him broke. He pressed his hand against his chest as though trying to hold his heart together, but it was too late. For the first time in years, Michael Harper felt powerless, and it terrified him more than any hostile takeover ever could. Michael barely slept after that call. The words repeated in his head like a relentless echo, each time carving deeper into him. A daughter. 5 years old. Her name was Emily. He had built his entire life on facts and numbers, decisions based on logic and profit margins, yet nothing about this revelation followed any rule he understood. He lay in his penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling, the city still alive beyond the tall windows, but for the first time the city lights seemed meaningless. He felt betrayed, not just by Rachel, but by the passage of time itself. 5 years had slipped through his fingers, and with them, memories he should have been part of. By morning, his shock had twisted into anger. It was easier to cling to fury than to confront the ache growing inside him. He replayed their breakup in his head. Rachel had accused him of being cold, consumed by ambition, a man who couldn't see anything beyond the next deal or the next acquisition. He had dismissed her words then, convinced that love was a distraction, that emotions were liabilities. Now her silence felt like punishment. How dare she keep this from him? How dare she rob him of those years, the chance to see his child's first smile, to hear her first word, to be there when she needed a father? At the office, no one noticed his distraction. He walked through the glass doors of Harper Enterprises like the man he had always been, tall, composed, untouchable. Assistants greeted him, colleagues fell silent in his presence, and yet beneath the immaculate suit and commanding stride, his thoughts were chaos. The anger pulsed in him, coiled tight in every interaction. He snapped at his staff, dismissed questions without listening, and locked himself in his office. For the first time in years, he couldn't focus on the documents in front of him. The numbers blurred together, meaningless compared to the image he couldn't erase, a small girl with dark hair and, as Rachel had whispered, his blue eyes. The thought unsettled him. Those eyes had been the one feature people always commented on, striking against his dark hair, impossible to ignore. To imagine them on a child, his child, made everything frighteningly real. Anger flickered again, but it was no longer just for Rachel. It turned inward, bitter and corrosive. How had he not seen the possibility? How had he not asked more, fought harder, looked beyond his pride when she walked away? That evening, when he returned home, the silence of his apartment pressed down on him heavier than ever. He poured himself a drink, but the whiskey did nothing to dull the storm inside. He stood before the tall windows, watching the glow of New York, but instead of the familiar pride, all he saw was emptiness. Millions of people below, millions of stories unfolding, and somewhere among them a little girl with his blood running through her veins was living a life without him. The anger and disbelief twisted into something unfamiliar and terrifying, fear. What if she hated him? What if she wanted nothing to do with him? What if it was too late to be part of her life? The thought sliced through him more sharply than the initial shock. He had faced ruthless competitors, stood before boards of directors eager to see him fail, survived scandals that would have destroyed lesser men. But the idea of standing in front of a 5-year-old girl and seeing rejection in her eyes filled him with dread he had never known. He set the untouched glass down on the counter and pressed his palms against the cool surface, breathing heavily. He didn't know what to do. He had built an empire, but now he stood in the ruins of his own ignorance, and for the first time in years Michael Harper wondered if he had already lost the one thing that could ever truly matter. The drive to Rachel's town felt longer than it was, though Michael's car devoured the miles with ease. The city slowly gave way to quiet roads lined with trees and small houses, each one seeming to carry a life so different from his own polished, demanding world. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw locked, his chest heavy with anticipation and fear. Every turn in the road brought him closer not only to the woman he once loved but also to the truth he had tried to deny since the call. He had imagined this meeting 100 different ways in the sleepless nights that followed, but no scenario brought him comfort. He had no script to follow, no negotiation strategy to rely on. For perhaps the first time, he was walking into something where control wasn't his to claim. When he finally parked in front of Rachel's small white house with its blue shutters and overgrown garden, he sat still for a long moment, staring at it. The house was modest, nothing like the penthouse suites or luxury apartments he was accustomed to, yet it felt alive in a way his world never did. Toys were scattered across the front yard, a small plastic slide, a stuffed bear abandoned on the steps, chalk drawings fading on the driveway. Each object was a declaration that a child lived here, played here, laughed here. His chest tightened with the weight of it, with the realization that he had been absent from every single one of those moments. Rachel appeared at the door before he could even bring himself to knock. She looked older, though not in a way that diminished her beauty. Time had etched itself into her, softening the edges of the woman he once knew, giving her a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. She hesitated, her hand on the doorframe, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to let him in. Their eyes met, and for a moment they were both silent, trapped in the gravity of everything unsaid. Finally, she stepped aside, her voice low but steady. "She's inside." The living room smelled faintly of vanilla and fresh laundry. It was warm, cluttered with drawings pinned to the wall, shelves filled with children's books, and a basket of toys near the couch. For a man who had lived in pristine spaces designed to impress, the room was almost disarming in its intimacy. He stood stiffly, unsure if he belonged, until he heard the light patter of footsteps. A small figure appeared at the doorway. The little girl had dark hair that fell in soft waves around her face, and her eyes, when she lifted them to meet his, were impossibly blue, the same piercing shade he saw in the mirror every morning. The sight of her was a blow so powerful he felt his breath catch. She was real, not a concept, not a whispered truth over the phone. She was flesh and blood, and undeniably his. The girl clutched a worn-out stuffed rabbit in her hands and half hid behind Rachel, peeking out with cautious curiosity. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, fragile and unsure. "Mom, is that him?" Michael's throat closed. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words would not come. He felt unworthy of speech in that moment, as though every syllable might fracture the delicate thread holding this encounter together. He dropped to one knee instinctively, lowering himself to her level, and simply looked at her. The resemblance was undeniable, yet it wasn't just the blue of her eyes. It was in the tilt of her chin, the small crease above her brow, the way she studied him with both suspicion and unspoken hope. Rachel rested a hand on Emily's shoulder, gently urging her forward. Michael's hands trembled, and he clenched them into fists against his knees to still them. He had closed billion-dollar deals without blinking, stood before ruthless investors without a trace of fear, but here he was shaking before a child who didn't yet know if he deserved to be called father. He finally found his voice, though it cracked in a way he hated. "Hello, Emily." The words were simple, inadequate, but they were all he could offer. The girl studied him for a long moment, her little fingers clutching the rabbit tighter. Then, with a cautious step, she moved slightly out from behind her mother. Her eyes didn't leave his, and in them he saw his entire world shift. Everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed, every late night in the office, all of it suddenly felt small compared to the possibility of this child's acceptance. In that single moment, Michael understood that nothing would ever be the same again. Michael could not stop staring at the girl as Rachel guided her gently into the kitchen. They sat at a small wooden table covered in faint scratches, the kind that spoke of years of meals, spilled juice, and restless little hands tapping impatient rhythms. For a moment Michael thought he should say something to her, to Emily, but the weight of her curious gaze froze him in place. She was still watching him, as if trying to decide whether he was friend or stranger, and he felt like both. He turned his attention to Rachel instead, because the silence between them demanded answers. The words came out harsher than he intended. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice echoed in the small kitchen, too loud, too sharp for the delicate air that surrounded the child sitting only a few feet away. Rachel flinched, and he regretted it instantly, but the anger had been simmering inside him for days and it refused to stay hidden. Rachel's hands folded together on the table, fingers twisting nervously. She looked at him with a mixture of defiance and sorrow. "You were not the man who could have handled it then, Michael. You were so consumed by your company, by being untouchable, that I couldn't even imagine you listening to me. I was scared." Her voice cracked slightly, but she forced herself to continue. "I thought you would turn me away, or worse, treat her like an inconvenience. I had to protect her." Her words cut deeper than any insult could. He wanted to argue, to insist she was wrong, but the truth pressed hard against him. He remembered how he had been during those years, driven to the point of cruelty, incapable of slowing down for anyone. She wasn't wrong to fear his reaction. What gnawed at him most was that she had been right. He lowered his eyes, ashamed at the version of himself she had described, a version that had cost him 5 years of his daughter's life. Emily climbed onto a chair beside her mother and began coloring with a few broken crayons left in a cup on the table. She was quiet, but her presence filled the room in a way Michael could hardly describe. He watched her carefully draw clumsy shapes, completely unaware of the storm raging between her parents. Each small movement of her hand reminded him of how much he had missed, her first words, her first steps, the countless tiny victories of growing up. He felt a pang of guilt so strong he had to steady his breathing. "I should have been there," he whispered, almost to himself. Rachel lifted her eyes, soft but firm, and nodded slowly. "Yes. But you weren't. And I did what I thought I had to do." Her honesty struck him harder than anger ever could. There was no venom in her words, no attempt to wound him. She was simply telling the truth, and it left him with nothing to shield himself. For a long time, the three of them sat in silence. The scratch of Emily's crayon against paper was the only sound in the room. Michael realized then that he couldn't go back and erase the past. No amount of money, no clever speech, no grand gesture would ever return those lost years. But he also realized something else, something that terrified him even more. He wanted a future with this child, with the girl who bore his eyes and carried a piece of him he had never known was missing. When Emily finally looked up from her drawing and showed him a picture, an uneven circle with lines shooting out of it, proudly declared as the sun, he felt something collapse inside him. He smiled at her through tears he hadn't expected and said, "It's beautiful." In that moment he knew the truth Rachel had tried to tell him from the beginning. Emily didn't need a man defined by power or wealth. She needed a father who would show up, who would be there, who would love her without conditions. Michael had spent his life mastering control, but as he sat there watching his daughter's smile spread across her face, he understood that control was the one thing he had to surrender if he ever wanted to deserve her. The first visits were clumsy and uncomfortable, though Michael tried to hide it behind the careful politeness he had perfected in boardrooms. He would arrive on Saturdays, sometimes with flowers for Rachel, always with something for Emily, a doll, a puzzle, a book he thought might impress her. But Emily didn't seem interested in expensive gifts. She accepted them with a quiet smile and then put them aside, as if testing to see whether he would stay once the novelty faded. It unnerved him at first. He was a man used to winning people over with grand gestures, but with her it was different. She wasn't impressed by price tags or shiny packaging. She only watched him closely, her little head tilted, as though she was studying not what he gave her but who he was when the gift was no longer between them. Michael realized quickly that he couldn't buy his way into her trust. Instead, he began to linger on the floor with her while she built towers from colorful blocks, letting her decide when to hand him a piece. At first she ignored him, but eventually she slid a blue block across the carpet and waited to see what he would do. He placed it carefully where she pointed, and something in her expression softened. It was a small victory, so minor compared to the triumphs he was used to chasing, yet it filled him with a satisfaction he had never felt in his life. Each week he learned something new about her. She loved to draw suns and flowers, even if the petals never quite matched. She laughed at silly voices and begged for one more story at bedtime. She hated when carrots touched the mashed potatoes on her plate but adored pancakes shaped like animals. These discoveries, ordinary and mundane to anyone else, were treasures to Michael. They were glimpses into the years he had lost, and though guilt still lingered, it was slowly being replaced by awe at the miracle of simply knowing her. Rachel watched from the sidelines, cautious but not unkind. At first she kept her distance, allowing Emily to set the pace. Yet as the weeks passed, she began to see that Michael wasn't the man she had left behind. He was quieter now, less consumed by the need to dominate every moment. Sometimes, when Emily ran into his arms without hesitation, Rachel's eyes softened with something almost like forgiveness, though she never said it aloud. One evening, after a long afternoon at the park where Michael had pushed Emily on the swings until his arms ached, they sat on the porch eating ice cream cones. Emily's cheeks were sticky, her laughter spilling into the warm air as she leaned against his side without a second thought. Michael looked down at her, the smear of chocolate across her chin, the trust in her eyes, and felt a surge of something he had long believed himself incapable of. It was more than pride, deeper than joy. It was love, raw and overwhelming, love that carried with it the sharp edge of regret but also the fierce determination never to lose what he had finally found. That night, when he left Rachel's house, he sat in his car for a long time, staring at the darkened windows where he knew Emily was sleeping. The city felt far away, the empire he had built even farther. He understood now that his life had shifted forever. Deals, profits, acquisitions, those things still mattered, but they no longer defined him. For the first time, he wanted something not for the sake of ambition, not for the sake of pride, but simply because it was his heart's truth. He wanted to be her father, truly and completely, in every way that mattered. And as he drove back to his empty penthouse, Michael knew that each visit, each laugh, each small hand that reached for his would bring him closer to the man he should have been all along. The calm rhythm of those weekends with Emily began to feel like the most valuable part of Michael's life, yet in the background the storm of his professional world was growing darker. At first it was subtle, whispers of a competitor probing into Harper Enterprises, anonymous rumors slipping into the business pages of the newspapers, quiet calls from investors who suddenly wanted reassurance. Michael had dealt with such things before, but this time the timing was cruel. Just as he was beginning to discover what it meant to be a father, the empire he had built was threatening to collapse around him. Meetings became longer, tempers in the boardroom shorter, and everywhere he went he sensed suspicion. There were accusations of questionable contracts, of insider dealings, even though much of it was fabricated by rivals eager to strike while he seemed distracted. He had always been relentless in business, but now he found himself divided. When he was at the office, his thoughts drifted to Emily's laugh, the way she had started slipping her small hand into his without hesitation. When he was with Emily, guilt gnawed at him for not being in the office defending his company. For the first time in his life, he could not simply bury himself in work to solve his problems. Rachel noticed the change in him. One evening when he arrived at her house, later than promised, with his tie loose and exhaustion etched into his face, she studied him quietly. After Emily had gone to bed, she asked what was happening. Michael, who rarely admitted weakness to anyone, felt the weight of her gaze and finally confessed. He told her about the investigations, the competitors circling like vultures, the journalists who had begun to dig into his private life. He admitted that he feared not only for his company but for how the scandal might touch Emily. His voice trembled as he said it, because even the idea of her innocence being tainted by his mistakes was unbearable. Rachel sat across from him at the kitchen table, her hands folded, her expression thoughtful. "You've always believed your worth came from that company," she said softly. "But Michael, Emily doesn't need a man who can save an empire. She needs her father. She needs you present, even if the rest of the world falls apart." Her words struck him harder than any boardroom battle. He wanted to argue, to insist that if he lost everything he would have nothing to give Emily, but he saw the calm certainty in Rachel's eyes and faltered. He realized she was right. Emily didn't measure him by balance sheets or headlines. To her, he wasn't a CEO or a millionaire, he was the man who pushed her on swings, who learned to braid her doll's hair badly, who made pancakes in the shape of hearts even when they came out lopsided. That night, alone in his car before he drove away, Michael pressed his forehead against the steering wheel. The weight of both worlds pressed down on him, one built of steel and glass, the other made of laughter and crayons, and he knew he could no longer keep them separate. If the press uncovered Emily's existence, she could be thrust into a spotlight she didn't ask for. If the company fell, the life of wealth and security he had always assumed he would pass on to his family might vanish. Yet Rachel's words echoed in him, steady and undeniable. Emily didn't need wealth. She needed love. She needed him. The realization both terrified and freed him. For the first time, he considered that losing his company might not mean losing everything. What he could not afford to lose was the little girl who looked at him with trust in her blue eyes, the girl who had no idea how much she had already saved him simply by existing. And with that thought came a strange clarity. He would fight for his company, yes, but not at the cost of the fragile, precious bond he was building with his daughter. If he had to choose, he knew where his loyalty truly belonged. It happened faster than Michael could have prepared for. A single headline, printed on the front page of a business journal, exposed what the gossip had only hinted at. The powerful CEO who had built an empire in the heart of Manhattan had a secret daughter he had hidden from the world for 5 years. Within hours the story spread across every major outlet. Photographs of him walking out of Rachel's small white house, candid shots of Emily playing in the yard, even an old picture of him and Rachel together, all became fuel for the fire. By the next morning, he could not escape the barrage of calls, messages, and questions. Investors demanded clarity, the board called emergency meetings, and reporters camped outside both his corporate headquarters and Rachel's home. The story had become a scandal, and in the ruthless world of business, scandal could topple even the strongest man. For a few days Michael tried to contain it. He released a short statement through his office, one carefully written by his legal team, vague enough to acknowledge the situation without offering details. But it only fueled more speculation. Rumors multiplied, each one more poisonous than the last. Some claimed he had abandoned Rachel and the child deliberately, others accused him of attempting to erase them to protect his image. None of it was true, but the truth was never as interesting to the public as the story they wanted to believe. What hurt most was knowing that Emily's face, her small innocent smile, was being splashed across screens and papers in ways she could never understand. Rachel confronted him one evening after another day of reporters swarming the neighborhood. She was angry, her voice trembling with frustration. "She's 5 years old, Michael. She doesn't deserve this circus. You wanted to be part of her life, then protect her. Don't let her be dragged through your mess." He had no defense. He stood in her kitchen, exhausted, his chest heavy with guilt. All his instincts told him to hide, to retreat, to let the storm burn itself out. That was how he had survived every other scandal in his career. But Rachel's words pierced through his armor. Emily wasn't a deal to manage or a reputation to polish. She was a child, and she needed him to choose her, even in front of the world. The next morning, Michael made a decision that shocked not only his board but himself. He called a press conference. The company's communications team begged him to reconsider, warning that emotions made men reckless, that vulnerability was weakness. But he refused to listen. For once, he would not let others dictate the narrative. When the cameras lit up and microphones were thrust toward him, he didn't stand behind a podium or hide behind corporate language. Instead, he stepped out holding Emily in his arms, her small fingers gripping the collar of his suit jacket. The room fell silent, as though the entire world had paused to witness the moment. His voice was steady, though his heart thundered in his chest. "You've all heard the rumors. You've read the headlines. But let me tell you the truth. This is my daughter. Her name is Emily. I didn't know about her until recently, but from the moment I did, my life changed forever. I am proud to be her father. Nothing else matters." The simplicity of his words disarmed the press. For once, he didn't sound like a man rehearsed by lawyers or sculpted by advisors. He sounded like a man stripped bare, speaking from a place no scandal could reach. Cameras flashed, questions flew, but Michael didn't waver. He held Emily close, whispering reassurances in her ear while she clung to him, shy but calm in the face of the chaos. That image spread across the world within hours, the powerful CEO, not behind glass walls or luxury cars, but as a father protecting his child. The public's perception shifted almost instantly. What had been painted as a scandal transformed into a story of redemption. Some still criticized him, of course, but many saw the humanity in him for the first time. For years he had been known as ruthless, cold, untouchable, yet here he was exposing the one part of himself that could not be spun or faked. Later that evening, when the house was finally quiet again, Rachel looked at him differently. She didn't say anything at first, just studied him as he sat on the couch with Emily asleep against his chest. Finally, she spoke in a voice softer than he had heard in years. "You've never done anything like that before." He met her eyes, exhausted but certain. "Because nothing has ever mattered like this before." It was in that moment Michael understood that he had taken the greatest risk of his life. He had placed his entire reputation, his career, his empire on the line, and for the first time he didn't care about the consequences. All that mattered was the small girl breathing peacefully in his arms, and the knowledge that he had claimed her, fully and without shame, before the entire world. A year later the chaos of that scandal felt like a distant storm that had passed, leaving behind a clearer sky and a life Michael had never imagined he could live. Harper Enterprises had survived the crisis, though not without scars. Investors who once doubted him had watched the way he stood firm during the public storm and found a new respect for him. Some deals had been lost, but others had come in unexpected ways, from partners who valued not just his financial acumen but his newfound humanity. The company was smaller in some ways, leaner, less obsessed with endless growth, yet stronger where it mattered. For Michael, though, the company was no longer the center of his universe. That place had been taken by a little girl who now ran into his arms every time he stepped through the front door of Rachel's house. Michael had moved out of his glass fortress in Manhattan and into a home not far from Rachel and Emily. It was a house with creaking floorboards, a backyard with a swing set, and a kitchen that smelled of pancakes on Sunday mornings. For a man who once measured success by skyscrapers and private jets, it was humbling to realize how little those things meant compared to the sound of his daughter's laughter echoing down a hallway. He found himself learning to live in ways he had never bothered to before. He helped Emily with kindergarten projects, fumbling with safety scissors and glue sticks. He burned his first attempt at baking cookies with her, only to laugh until his sides ached when she insisted the misshapen lumps were perfect. He learned how to braid her hair badly, took her to swimming lessons, and sat on the porch at night telling her stories about the stars. Rachel, at first cautious, slowly allowed herself to trust the man he was becoming. Their conversations shifted from guarded exchanges to quiet companionship. She saw the way he never missed a school recital, how he sat cross-legged on the floor to sip imaginary tea from tiny plastic cups, how he no longer checked his phone every 5 minutes when he was with Emily. He was still Michael Harper, the man whose name once commanded entire boardrooms, but he was also something more, something deeper, more fragile, and infinitely more important. He was a father, and with each passing day Rachel began to believe that perhaps he could once again be something to her as well. There were still struggles. The world did not forget easily, and occasionally old headlines resurfaced, sparking whispers and questions. But Michael no longer faced them with fear. He faced them with the quiet certainty that no article or rumor could define him more than the way Emily's arms wrapped around his neck or the way Rachel's hand lingered against his when she passed him a cup of coffee in the morning. Slowly, piece by piece, the walls between them eroded. On a warm summer afternoon, Michael found himself in the backyard, pushing Emily on the swing. She squealed with delight as her small legs kicked against the air, her laughter carrying high into the open sky. Rachel sat nearby on the porch steps, her smile soft as she watched them. Emily tilted her head back, hair flying, and shouted over the wind, "Daddy, are we always going to be together now?" The words pierced him with a kind of sweetness he had never known. He stopped the swing gently, crouched in front of her, and placed his hands on her tiny shoulders. "Always, sweetheart." "Always," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Her blue eyes, the same eyes he saw in the mirror, lit up with joy as she threw her arms around his neck. Rachel watched them quietly, her heart stirring with a mix of relief and tenderness. For years she had carried the burden alone, afraid that he would never be capable of love beyond ambition. But here he was, not only proving her wrong, but showing her a man she had once hoped he could become. When their eyes met across the yard, no words were needed. The promise was clear in the way he held Emily, in the way his shoulders softened, in the way his heart seemed finally at peace. In that moment Michael understood that the life he had built, polished and powerful though it had been hollow compared to this. He had chased wealth, control, and dominance, believing they defined him. But true power was in this fragile, unbreakable bond with a little girl who trusted him without condition and a woman who, against all odds, was allowing love to return to her heart. The man who once stood alone in a tower of glass now stood rooted in something far stronger, a family. And for the first time, he felt whole. This story, to me, is less about wealth, power, or scandal, and more about the fragility of time and the choices we make when confronted with truths we can no longer ignore. Michael's journey feels like a reminder that success without love is hollow, and that redemption rarely comes in the form of grand gestures but rather in the quiet, consistent presence we offer the people who matter most. What I admire in this ending is that it doesn't promise perfection. Rachel's trust is hard-won, Emily's future will still carry shadows of the years lost, but it offers something more meaningful, a man who finally learns that the greatest empire he could ever build is not made of glass towers or financial victories, but of laughter in a backyard, bedtime stories, and a child's unwavering belief that he will be there tomorrow. That, to me, is both the shock and the beauty of the tale. It shows how a life can be rebuilt not by erasing mistakes, but by choosing differently from this moment forward.